folks. You're listening to the Idea Roastery. I'm Herman.
And I'm Jason.
Jason, how do you feel about private companies collecting your personal information and data?
I have mixed thoughts on this topic. I've usually been very anti collection of data. One of the things I noticed about the UK is that they seem to be a little bit more au fait with just handing over very sort of personal information, i.e., like just signing up for an event the other day. They ask you for your address, they ask you for your phone number. And as far as I remember in South Africa, a lot of the events platforms I signed up to never ask for that detail, especially for an event that's free. So in that case, I don't necessarily like it. But as a person who's trying to build a small company and I've started running ads, when it comes to targeting, I think not having the ability to target people has resulted in competing against like the likes of Amazon. So for instance, I was helping build like a e-commerce site, and obviously to run ads there, we want to specifically target a certain demographic of user because like our product's not going to be useful to just anybody. But then you like check the metrics and it's like you're competing against Amazon, you're competing a bit against like these big players. And so it kind of means that you just blow loads of money on not being able to target correctly. So in that sense, I don't like it, but I think there is a sort of common ground that maybe sits in the middle.
I had to sign up, or had to is a rich word. I signed up for a gym at the beginning of this week because I'm down the Cape Peninsula at the moment, just decompressing after my time in Istanbul. And it's a beautiful gym. It's right in Simonstown and it overlooks the ocean. It's called Ocean Edge Fitness. And you can watch the seagulls and do hip thrusts at the same time. But they gave me a form to fill out to sign up. And they wanted my usual stuff, my name and my email address, and my phone number, and my ID, and like a copy of my ID. They wanted to take a scan of my ID, and they wanted my home address. And I didn't give them any of that. Well, I gave them a version of it. I just gave them a whole bunch of fake information because they don't need that information. They don't need to have my ID number like at all. And I think that the more people or the more organizations that ask me for like a copy of my ID opens up the door to making impersonation easier. You know, people identity theft, if you will. And that was very much not okay. However, I do also understand the usefulness for companies to have access to a bunch of information, uh, with the caveat, they don't need your ID number for anything. Like, geez, that's a whole other thing. But I do understand why companies want to know what your users' preferences are, et cetera, to improve services and to target ads and stuff like that. However, in many ways, like I just dislike the concept of that. And as you know, I was at MicroConf last week, and I was speaking to a whole bunch of other business owners, and people were very surprised to hear that I don't collect user data on Bear, on the blogging platform. Like, I don't have a sales funnel. I don't track where the users came from and how they converted and if they bounced off the page or anything like that. I'm like purely running on vibes here. And so, so people were very, very shocked to hear that that is the case. But that's because, you know, Bear is kind of like a philosophical extension of uh, a couple of ideals that I hold. Whether they face up to reality or not is kind of immaterial. It's just like, again, purely vibes. Uh, but that being said, I think that it's a mixed bag. I think that you have your, you know, the privacy maximalists, and then you have the rest of the population which don't really think about it. The app says, "Hi, we're going to have access to all of your personal information and your location data," and they don't even read that, and they just say, "Okay," because they want to use the app. And so that's kind of like that's the two camps when it comes to the collection of personal information.
Yeah. It's quite topical at the moment because I don't know if you've heard, but the UK is currently considering digital identities,
Mm, so,
um, which I think has also caused a lot of like there's a lot of like panic about it from, as you say, the privacy maximalists. To be honest, I'm kind of like ambivalent to it, which kind of might surprise a lot of people because I think my basis is because, in South Africa, as you mentioned, you have an ID number. Like everyone has an ID number. I've never really been at the behest of any like ID number breach that's kind of like been detrimental to me. And I think also part of it, maybe in the sense of ID and just people stealing identities. I think the problem with having an ID and getting it into the wrong hands is that usually the onus is on the person if that gets into the wrong hands. Whereas I think if you have an ID system where the onus is on the company, i.e., if like someone signs up for a bank account using your credentials, I should not be held responsible for that. It should be the company because they gave a bank account to someone that they didn't verify. And I think the problem is that like people think of identity theft and think, oh, someone's going to go open up a bank account in another foreign country under my name, which I think is fair if it is a system like that, where it's like we're going to penalize that person because you let your identity go. But if it's a government system, I don't think there should be that problem anyway. And the other
yeah.
side is also the technology that I think they've been using is not necessarily a central database of all the ID numbers. There are identity mechanisms where you can have sort of a more distributed identity, i.e., like in some cases you have like like on your phone when you have a Google Wallet, like the token for the wallet is in your phone. It's not in the cloud somewhere. Else you wouldn't be able to use it if you go underground, for instance. So it's like I'm kind of in a mixed sense about it. Mostly, I guess, because South Africa has had like data leaks, I guess, but it's not really been a problem for me. But yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are on like just having an ID in general.
So I actually feel very differently when it comes to the public sector uh, gathering data than I do about the private sector because the incentives are different. Now, you still have your privacy and your your privacy maximalists and your people who are completely ambivalent when it comes to it. At the end of the day, the purpose of government is to serve the people, at least in an ideal world. If you speak to privacy maximalists, they'll say that the purpose of government is to accumulate more power, but you know, it comes down to where you are and it comes down to personal opinion over there. However, it boggles my mind that places like the United States doesn't have an ID card because they still have to do identity verification, right? Like when you interface with government, you need to identify yourself, but they don't have a cohesive way to identify themselves. So they use a combination of driver's licenses and social security numbers and this and that, right? And essentially what this does is it goes and it makes government terribly, terribly inefficient because now you need to have multiple authentication systems instead of like one unified authentication system. And so if you want your government to operate well, right? Let's assume for a second that you're in a robust democracy and the incentives of the government are mostly aligned with making sure that the population does well, right? Then you really want them to be efficient. You really want them to have less bureaucracy and to be able to get things done. And so, yes, I kind of do want the government to collect data. It's like, if we say like, oh, the roads are a terrible mess because there's just traffic everywhere, and people are speeding and crashing into buildings. And then it was like, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to put a couple of government officials at the traffic lights for, the next 5 weeks, and we're going to monitor traffic going through there so that we can better make decisions about how to optimize this. We're going to put up some speed cameras to catch people who are speeding. All of these things are infringements of privacy, but they're also fundamental to making the city better, to improving the problems that we have. So I think that there is a very good distinction over here. Again, assuming that your government isn't hostile, um, where the purpose of it is to make things better. However, with the private sector, the idea is to sell you things, right? That's the purpose of the private sector. And so like I'm okay with my data being processed by the government to make better decisions about how to serve the population. Um, However, I'm less okay with my data being processed by private organizations on how to uh, sell me things better.
I think the other thing that kind of prompted wanting to talk about this is, as you mentioned, yeah, like there's nothing better if you look at the software world, like there's nothing better than a primary key to figure out like what two elements in two different tables like are related. Um, and the UK has also got the same problem as you talked about in the US. It's like each a government organization has its own kind of system for collecting that information. So you might have like a national insurance number, you might have an NHS number, you'll have all these pieces of data. You have a driver's license, number. There's all these forms of identity, but there's no single one that kind of connects them all together. And I agree with you in terms of the measurement aspect, because the other thing that prompted this is I saw this article about ONS, which is like the statistics body of the UK, and most governments have like I think Stats SA or like some team
Some
of
data
people that are
collection firm.
that
Yeah, yeah.
basically are their job is to do like a census, which they kind of gather like what are the problems and what's the demographics of the country, what are the different, problem points. And the article that I read is that in the UK the ONS is like dramatically underfunded. There's not that many people that actually want to do that job. And so some of the data has actually been wrong. And similar to almost, I guess, in a privacy centric world, like having the incorrect data means that you're making a bad decision. And so my thought is that if it's really hard to kind of even measure what's going on in your economy, which is very a complicated thing to do as it is, but how do you even start to think about allocating funds? Because a lot of what policymakers do is read the statistics. They see, okay, well, job market is going up, or there's more people like entering the workforce, or there's more, potholes or whatever they're measuring, and then they'll create policies based on that. But if you've got a bad data set, or you've got bad data coming in, you're going to make the wrong decisions. And almost like a product manager who has like you know the wrong metric, they're gonna fuck up the project,
Completely.
like yeah. So
So I think if we can just play devil's advocate for a little bit over here, the case for not allowing government access to this kind of information is predicated on the idea that governments are actively hostile to their constituents, and that they are really trying to control the population, and they're trying to accumulate power. And you can definitely see this, like, let's take, for instance, China, for example, is like that's an information state, right? It gathers information on its population and it uses that to ensure that the population does what it says needs to be done, um, for better or for worse, right? And so there is that case to be made, and there is that case to, be made about them using that to like find political dissidents, to create a social credit system, which is used to ensure that you conform to the party's ideology, right? It's like, oh, I said some nasty things on social media about the government, and now I can't get a home loan is a pretty big deal. Um, However, we're speaking from two countries that are ostensibly free and open. Um, and so it doesn't necessarily makes sense to have such big information lockdown over here, and the problems that we have here and in the UK. Actually, that's one big parallel, is that governments are terribly inefficient and they're not getting stuff done very well. Um, and so I don't think it's necessarily malice that's the problem over here, it's bureaucracy. And if we can cut down on some bureaucracy, like here's one of the things that was crazy to me. Um, back during the United States election, uh, there were all these claims about like a whole bunch of non-citizens voting, right? And like I didn't really fully understand how the identity system worked in the United States at the time, and I'm like, how how do you not know? How do you not know if these people are citizens? And it's just because let me just sorry if I'm on a bit of a tangent over here, but do you know how property is handled in the United States, like property ownership?
Is it a registry office?
No, there's no registry office. Instead, it's like the property title is the source of truth, and it is handed to the next owner and the next owner and the next owner, right? It's so fragmented because there is no single source of truth. It's so fragmented to the extent that in order to get a home loan or a mortgage to buy a property, for banks to rid themselves of the risk of someone else coming along and saying, like, actually, this property belongs to me, you have to take out insurance to kind of ensure that if someone comes along with a better claim, that the bank doesn't lose out on all that money. That's a crazy thing. Like imagine like and that's such a big part of the economy over there. These companies are raking in billions of dollars per year, all because the United States just doesn't have a property registry that says like this piece of
Yeah.
land over here is allocated to Joe Baker.
I to be honest, I think actually it's the same in the UK because the UK used to have lords and there used to be like you were allocated land based on like your status in society. But I think that even though there is a registry office or there's a sort of registry for land, you only have to go there if you actually want to exchange your land, right? So you don't actually have to register until you want to like sell the property. And so there's large areas of the UK that no one knows who they own by because no one's like come to claim them. And this is also part of the whole like land value tax kind of debate is that like there's just parts of the UK in the same sense that no like nobody knows who's the owner. But I think there was one YouTuber who like was talking about like the moment he put like you know an old car on the side, like suddenly the owner like started contacting the council to get it removed. But like before that point, there was like no one knew who was the owner. So kind of yeah, I guess it is a bit wild, but I think also in the ID context, we're kind of assuming that companies aren't smart enough to do this kind of connecting together the dots anyway, right? I think we've had surveillance around for like years and years. I remember surveillance being a topic like 20 years ago. Um, I think even to this point, like you've got like companies like Palantir and stuff that are like I mean, it's not, I don't think it's a trivial task to kind of connect these different data sets together, right? Maybe if you've got a very generic name like Joe Smith or whatever, then maybe it might be a bit of a topic. But I think there's already a lot going on. And I guess I agree in terms of the players, like if someone does get into power that wants to use it for like, enshrining themselves as like a, dictator, then it is a slippery slope. But maybe the benefits that come from having more efficiency in government would actually also be a net positive that would allow for a lot more sort of activity internally in the country um so it's like it's a very sort of I get the whole point of like if there's a negative aspect you just say no, right? Like it's but then when you see so the other point that I'm also thinking is that what a lot of people maybe neglect is that the nefariousness of those processes, right? And what I mean by this is that I believe that there are people who are maybe criminal in their intent, or they're benefiting a lot from the status quo. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are like pressures that are put through those people. People who have tax havens, tax benefits, maybe criminal organizations that kind of benefit from not having like a way to identify people. And I think people maybe not don't they neglect that a little bit is that there are people who are in a vested interest to keep it the way that it is because of that nature of it. So in those cases, I'm just like, London's always been known as like a hotbed for, financial crimes and money laundering. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there is like a bit of a pressure point being like put on to say like I mean, it's happening in like we have this company's house where people have to now actually declare who owns the businesses and you have to like validate that every year. And so it's also wild that you could have a business that no one knows who the owner is or where they're located. And there's nothing for that other than money laundering that I can see to have your name sort of in all of these shell companies. So I think there is like positive that can come from it. But as you mentioned, it's a very difficult sort of line to tease apart.
Yeah, so like say what you will about the South African government. Our most competent branch is our it's our tax man. It's SARS, South African Revenue Service. And I think that it is fully a necessary thing for society. And so I think anything that we can do to ensure that people do pay their taxes is good. Especially because when people dodge their taxes, it makes the people who are paying their taxes feel a lot worse, like they're being taken for a ride. And if we want to build a high trust society, we need to make sure that everyone's doing their fair share. So one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is that with the rise of these large language models, ChatGPT, Grok, Claude, et cetera, it is going to completely or is already changing the face of what an audit looks like because what how things currently work is something needs to alert the receiver of revenue that something isn't stacking up over here in this person's accounts. And so then they need to appoint a human who has to take time out of their very busy day to go through the ledgers, go through the receipts, and say like, oh, I see that, R1 million is disappearing somewhere over here. Then let's like try and account for it. Whereas we now have the ability to implement systems that go through everything automatically. Now, this is going to have a two-factor effect. Yes, it's going to catch people who are tax dodging, but it will also increase voluntary compliance because people know that like an AI is going to go through this, as opposed to like maybe I won't get audited this year. And so I think that that is a benefit for society.
The downside is like as we probably know as small businesses, people do like make mistakes every now and again. So as long as it's not like oh you're like that we'll pick up this small discrepancy in how you're declaring something and suddenly you're like getting thrown in the slammer.
But
It's
that's never really been the case, is
it's
that
never
like
really been the case, but I think that's maybe what people get worried about is that there has always been, I mean, in South Africa and the UK, there's like a thick brush policies where they don't really just think about like smaller players or smaller businesses. And I think especially in the next couple of years, small businesses are going to play a part. But I think it will increase efficiency, right? And it will increase, people paying the right amount of VAT. It might also, this is the other thing that I wanted to talk about is like if you have a system where you're kind of your business is plugged into the government all the time, they could actually use that to figure out, how consumer spending is doing, like how many people are buying and selling goods. And that could even be because, like, if you look at things like GDP, people say like GDP or CPI, all these kind of like metrics about the economy. To a lot of extent, they're kind of estimates. They're based on like how much tax came in. Like, there's only certain, gross domestic product. How can you measure the output of all the companies in your economy? So I think having these kind of like plugged in systems for the government might actually be good because they could say like
it changes it from estimates to like actual like it's a resource allocation problem, right?
exactly. I mean it's the same as like a lot of people say like oh, inflation is like, 4%, but real inflation that people are actually feeling is like 10%. But that's also like an estimate. So you could actually see the inflation in people's sort of taxes or in people's spending. And that could also help, drive policy decisions and say, okay, well, maybe people are actually struggling. And it may be, but then again, you could still have the interpretation is where the mystery comes in, right? Like you might have the data there and someone just spins it in a specific way. But I think generally it could make things a little bit more efficient. But the other side is especially things like um, I went down the route of like looking at sustainability and reporting and that kind of stuff. And that is also getting really like intrusively into like where does all your stuff come from? Like how much carbon, like how long is your light switched on? Like what
Hmm.
channel are you on your TV set at night? And like
And we're gonna ding your credit score, and now you can't get a home loan.
exactly. So like I looked at some of the like the EU's very like I get they've got like a this mandate to make everyone's life like much better. But I think the way that they're doing it by monitoring all of these different aspects of the economy is like a little bit intrusive. Not just because it's like a wide brush. If you're a small business, like it's fine to leave your lights on. But I think it's just, it can be a lot more admin that you have to do as a business, and that can also mean, you know, slower to get stuff done. And we've seen some of the results of that within the EU. But um, yeah, I think it's going to be something that's people are going to be talking a lot more about, especially online as well. Uh, Finding out who's who, what like who is actually posting what. It's going to be a little bit of a tricky next couple of years, I think.
Yeah, completely. I think that there's just something to be said about, data sovereignty over here as well. So I have like another persona, which is still Herman, but is just like a fake email address, or like it's actually an email address. It's just not one that I like tied to my identity. And it's a ID number that I can memorize, 'cause similar to my actual ID number, but with a few numbers changed here and there. And my home address is still the first place that I stayed at when I first moved to Cape Town, because I have the ability to create a proof of address for that, which is nice. And so, like, overall, I I'm not going to submit information like that to the bank, because that would be, data fraud. But if a gym asks me to sign up for a membership and then wants all that information, I'm giving them some bogus information.
Yeah. I think that needs to happen here. Like people need to stop asking. I mean, I've also started to like give false information, but I also think about the people who like, just signing onto a Wi-Fi router and they have to put in all those details. I'm like, this is ridiculous.
What is your mother's maiden name?
Yeah, exactly. It's like because that's also where it kind of gets into like the scam land because like if people are used to putting in their private information, the moment they get phished, it's like so easy because oh, well, I'm just logging into my Wi-Fi router, like it's just asking for these details. And that I guess I haven't really thought much about that aspect of it is like if you're used to giving out your information, then it just becomes easier for you to get scammed.
Yeah, like if a like a spear phishing attack were to take place, where you receive a phone call from your bank that calls you by your name and verifies that they know what your ID number is and that they know what your home address is. They just want you to, they do something along the lines of like, is your home address, for a security question, we're just going to ask you, is your home address this? And list a fake home address, and then this, and then they list your real home address. That feels very real because they have that information. Therefore, they are probably your bank, and it'll it'll fool a lot of people. Hell, like something could even fool me if I'm not actively like with my guard up. Although whenever I receive phone calls, my guard is up nowadays, and I think it is good to have your guard up. But the fact of the matter is that we shouldn't disseminate our information super freely at all.
Yeah. And so for your going back to I guess the SaaS land is like so how do you know how busy your app is? Like, or I guess you've got like traffic
I mean,
uh
I've got like
analytics.
naturally I can count the number of users who are on a platform, and I can count the
Okay.
number of people who signed up or
Who
upgraded
pay?
over the
Yeah,
last,
yeah. Okay.
week. But the only personally identifiable information that I have of people is their email address. And I actually prefer it that way because we're seeing more and more places have strict regulation around personal data, especially the EU with GDPR and all that. And I don't actually want to be responsible for people's data. Instead of being a good warden of the data, I just don't have that responsibility. If Bear were to have a big data leak, um, the the only thing that is valuable that would be leaked would be people's email addresses. Um, and the fact of the matter is that most people's email addresses are publicly somewhere on the internet already. So, that's kind of what you have. That being said, I do have a couple of those privacy maximalists on there, and I think I sent you a picture that someone mailed me physical currency for a lifetime subscription to so I received like 120 pounds in an envelope
Yeah, yeah,
from the UK
yeah.
to South Africa. I don't actually think that's legal. Um, like I think that there's some regulation in South Africa about that.
There's a cool podcast called Darknet Diaries, which is like this guy who like tries to interview these like scammers or hackers and stuff. And like I've been listening to it a lot like before bed. And yeah, like the cash base, like crypto, all of this kind of like secrecy stuff. Yeah, I mean it can be, yeah, I mean just even just preserving your identity online is a bit of a mission. Like and some people do it very well. But I guess yeah, that also,
Yeah.
the whole cash
Well,
cash based economy is also something.
here's the last key takeaway, or not a key takeaway, but a key piece of advice that I do recommend people do is that you have at least two email addresses. One of the email addresses, which is your ID online, it's what you use to log into services. And then there's the other email address, which is what people communicate with you on, right? So I know that Proton Mail has an identity as a service, where you can create lots of different aliases and login details that are then stored in your keychain. And so something like that is actually very, very useful because it means that people will have a much harder time compromising the things that are important because it's harder to connect that to your public
Yeah,
identity.
yeah. Have you set up a PGP key? Do
I
you have?
haven't, but it's a little bit overkill for me, to be honest.
Yeah, because I guess that's the other part is like impersonation. If
Like
I
email
mean, I guess
spoofing.
it, yeah, email spoofing.
Yeah.
Because that's
I mean,
also one of the things I've been
I have
listening
my
to.
record set up properly. Like I've got my
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
DMARC record set up so that it quarantines any emails that aren't sent from the verified servers and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah. Because I guess I feel like that technology might come back because in this world where, you need to verify a source online. I don't know why, like, if you're on Twitter, like you don't automatically have that. So if you've posted something, I mean, if you post something on Bear, for instance, like people could validate that it actually came from Bear in that sense. And then you could say like it came specifically from the source. And so anywhere on the internet, you can kind of say, well, did it come from this person? Like it doesn't match. So yeah, I think it's going to be a technology that people are going to think about a lot more. And I do agree with this like layering approach. I also use Firefox Relay, and there's a couple of other tools that are out there to kind of like give you like a sort of fake jumbled sort of forwarding address, which works for inbound, but not necessarily like outbound. But yeah, I think it's going to be a more important topic in the next couple of years, and I think as long as we're thinking about it now, we're going to be a little bit more prepared. We can obviously never predict what people will do, but yeah, it's going to be an interesting time
Yeah,
nonetheless.
definitely. Stay safe out there, folks.